Well, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Catherine McGarry. I'm the Mayor of the City of Cambridge and Chair of tonight's Special Council closed meeting and Special Council workshop. We continue to meet virtually, and I just want to take a moment to remind everyone to keep following public health advice, and please, if you have not already done so, please get vaccinated. That's our best way through this together. Our vaccination rates are strong, and today we had some exciting news as our Waterloo Region Airport reopens to international flights as of November 30th. So we know here in Cambridge and in the region that we're well poised for recovery, and so this reopening of international flights is such a positive signal towards that. Please continue to support local and to support those industries that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And as always, let's lead with kindness. Words and tone matter. I'd also like to remind everyone that as a result of physical distancing guidelines being in place, in-person public attendance at special meetings of council is not currently available. As this evening, we have a closed council meeting and a special council workshop. Delegations are not permitted, and once we are through our closed meeting, we will resume in public to complete the workshop portion of our meeting this evening. So let's move into today's agenda. I'm going to ask our clerk to complete a roll call of council so that we can confirm everyone's attendance as we're coming to you electronically today. Madam Clerk.
Councillor Atchade has sent his regrets this evening, as has Councillor Devine. Councillor Mehta.
Present.
Councillor Hamilton.
Present.
Councillor Liggett will join us shortly. Councillor Mann.
Present.
Councillor Reid.
Present.
Councillor Wolf.
Present.
Mayor McGarry.
Present.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd also like to welcome the staff that we have joining us, and joining us electronically today. We have our city manager, David Calder. We have our deputy city managers, David Bush, Hardy Bromberg, Cheryl Zonleiter, and Yogesh Shah. Our chief financial officer, Cheryl Ayers. Our city solicitor, Cheryl Ayers. Our city solicitor, Lisa Shields. We also have staff from other divisions joining us this evening, and they'll join the meeting when their item is up for discussion. And clerking the meeting today, we have our city clerk, Danielle Manton, and deputy city clerk, Jennifer Shaw. Just one moment. And I also wanted to just point out that actually Mike Parsons is standing in for Yogesh Shah. I didn't think you looked like him. Welcome, Mike. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today is the land traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We also acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. A reminder to members of council that the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act requires members of council to declare any direct or indirect pecuniary interest in relation to any matter under consideration. So members of council, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? And seeing none, we'll move forward with our agenda for today. We'll be beginning our meeting with a closed meeting, and then following that, we will resume in public session to conduct the special council workshop. So we'll now move into closed session, and Councillor Wolf, I believe you have this motion. Will you please read it in its entirety?
Could the clerk read it, please?
Thank you, Madam Clerk.
Moved by Councillor Wolf, seconded by Councillor Hamilton. Recommendation that in accordance with Section 2392C of the Municipal Act 2001, council convene in closed session to consider the following subject matters: proposed or pending acquisition or disposition of land by the municipality, property acquisition.
Thank you. Does council have any comments? Seeing none, I'm going to ask our clerk to call for the vote. Madam Clerk?
Councillor Mehta,
In favor?
Councillor Hamilton,
In favor.
Councillor Mann,
In favor?
Councillor Reed,
In favor.
Councillor Wolf,
In favor.
Mayor McGarry,
In favor.
and that carries.
Thank you. And we're just going to take a moment to ensure that the live stream is off YouTube before we continue. Welcome back, everyone. We're now going to rise from closed session. Councillor Reed, you have the motion to rise. Would you like the clerk to read it?
Yes, please.
Okay, Madam Clerk.
Moved by Councillor Reed, seconded by Councillor Mehta. Recommendation that council rise from closed session and reconvene in open session at 5:36 p.m.
Thank you. While in closed discussions I'll start that again. While in closed, discussions occurred amongst members of council and staff were provided with directions related to confidential property matters. And now we're going to vote. Madam Clerk?
Councillor Mehta,
In favor?
Councillor Hamilton,
In favor.
Councillor Mann,
In favor?
Councillor Reed,
In favor.
Councillor Wolf,
In favor.
Mayor McGarry,
In favor.
and that carries.
Thank you. So we'll now move ahead with our evening agenda. As today's meeting is a special council workshop, delegations will not be registered and members of council may only provide direction to staff and receive information. So this evening we have our Deputy City Manager, Dave Bush, Chief Financial Officer, Cheryl Ayres with us, as well as our Deputy Treasurer, Katie Fisher. So members of council will be encouraged to save their questions until the end of the presentation. I understand Mr. Bush will lead off the presentation and then hand it over to Ms. Ayres. Mr. Bush?
Thank you, Mayor McGarry, and through you. This evening, we want to share with council information about the city's debt capacity. Over the past few years, there have been significant projects that the city has been planning for to provide new infrastructure to the community. Examples of this are the Recreation Center, Fountain Street Soccer Facility, Preston Auditorium, the expansion there, and the Riverside Dam. With these projects, staff have continued to plan for future needs, provided information to council through reports and engagement through the community to seek input into the needs for these projects. With this work and engagement, the budget of each of these projects has increased to a point where the projects collectively are becoming unaffordable and will result in significant tax increase to pay off the debt that's required to finance each of these projects. As we deliver these and other future projects, we need to manage scope and community expectations while finding a balance that's affordable. The purpose of the presentation of the workshop this evening is simply to bring awareness to council so you're prepared and informed to make decisions as information comes forward over the next coming weeks through the budget process and reports that you will see. Overall, this is simply managing wants, needs, and expectations. This evening's workshop is grouped into 4 sections. The introduction, which I'm doing now. Cheryl Ayres will share background information as a reminder about legislation, regulations, and policies that we follow in allocating debt to infrastructure projects. Then we'll show you some comparators for debt forecasting with other large lower tier municipalities in Ontario, including our neighbors in Kitchener and Waterloo. And finally, we want to draw your attention to the risks we are faced with specific capital projects in our capital budget and forecast. Next slide, please. So before we get into the presentation and the workshop, I wanted to share some information with you from the Government Finance Officers Association, of which the city is a member. GFOA represents public finance officials throughout the United States and Canada and has more than 20,000 members at the federal, state, provincial, and local government levels. Their mission is simply to advance excellence in public finance And they do this through offering training, publishing guides and best practices for local government administration, and offer various award programs, of which the city has been a recipient of for our budget document and financial statements. In particular, the Guide for Elected Officials for Debt and Capacity Planning explains the strong collaboration between the administration and council that is necessary to have an effective financial plan in place for capital infrastructure. And it's important for building a thriving community. This workshop today helps meet those objectives, and it's opportunity for us to do our fiduciary duty and share with you some information and context that will help guide you in future decision-making as we bring forward the 2022 budget, as well as a couple of reports that you will see soon in regards to the Riverside Dam and the Preston Auditorium. There is a significant amount of debt that will need to be issued in the near future in order to support these projects, as well as other projects in the budget. And overall, the city's debt will need to increase to $120 million to meet those needs. Now, with that introduction, I'm going to hand it over to our Chief Financial Officer, Cheryl Ayers, to begin the workshop. Thank you.
Welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you, Dave. If you could move to the next slide, please. And just one more slide, please. So as per the Municipal Act, first I'll start off by giving a brief introduction or reminder about the legislation, regulations, and policy that we follow when allocating debt. So as per the Municipal Act, a municipality is permitted to issue debt to fund the development or redevelopment of capital infrastructure. This is no different than how each of us in our personal finances would need to go to the bank to be approved for a mortgage to buy a house, or a loan to do renovations to your home, or to make other large purchases like buying a car. Limits on the amount of borrowing are put in place to protect the creditor and to ensure individuals or businesses have sufficient revenue streams to repay the debt. Next slide, please. The province has established an annual repayment limit as the maximum amount of revenue that a municipality can commit annually to pay principal and interest payments for its long-term debt and other long-term financial commitments. The limit is calculated based on 25% of annual own source revenues, which includes revenues such as property taxes, user fees, and investment income. For 2021, the annual repayment limit for the City of Cambridge was 3%, which is well within the regulation limit of 25%, and shows the city has sufficient financial resources to repay our outstanding debt obligations. To provide some context about what these numbers mean, if our debt payments were 25% of own source revenues, we would have annual principal and interest payments of $31 million compared to our actual 2021 payments of $4.1 million. Next slide, please. Like many municipalities in Ontario, and according to best practices, Council has established a policy that further reduces the annual repayment limit to 10% of the city's own source revenues for tax-supported operations. Council policy also includes a limit of 15% for rate-supported operations of water and wastewater. Since these are more capital intensive, the annual repayment limit is a little bit higher. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we're currently within these limits. We're at 3% currently for tax-supported operations and 4% for rate-supported. Council's debt management policies ensure the city has long-term financial flexibility and sustainability while limiting financial vulnerability. It also ensures the city's financial practices comply with statutory requirements. Next slide, please. And one more slide, please. Before we get into the next slides, just to provide some context, if you look at the top row of the chart of this slide, it shows the current city currently has $45.7 million in issued debt, and it's repaid from various sources. The second row on this slide shows we have $52.2 million in approved debt that has not yet been issued. With the 2022 capital budget, we're forecasting that we will need additional debt of $119 million, which will bring the total debt outstanding to $217 million. Looking at this in terms of the structure of council's policy, we're forecasting $79.3 million of the total to be repaid from tax-supported operations. 97.5 is expected to be repaid from future DCs collected as growth occurs, and 40.2 million from water and wastewater operations. In the calculation of our annual repayment limit, DC debt is combined with the tax-supported debt, which helps to minimize risk in the event that there's a downturn in the economy, similar to what we've seen recently. If revenues collected from DCs are not enough to meet the debt payments, then they have to be paid from tax-supported funds. Next slide, please. Our current tax annual repayment limit based on debt issued to date of the 45.7 million, which I mentioned on the previous slide, is 3.3%. As we issue more debt and reach our forecast amount of 217 million, this will rise to a peak of approximately 9.6% by 2026. While this is within the limit of 10% set out in the city's policy and the provincial limit of 25%, we also need to consider the impact this has on the city's tax levy and monitor Cambridge's tax affordability relative to our comparators. While our tax debt limit is increasing, our neighbors in Kitchener and Waterloo are forecasting overall decreases in the amount of debt outstanding in future years based on information contained in their 2021 budgets. Waterloo is paying down their outstanding debt from Rim Park, and Kitchener is paying down their debt from a previous economic development program. On this slide, you can see the comparison of Cambridge's forecast debt repayment limit compared to the median of Ontario lower tier municipalities with populations over 100,000 and compared to Kitchener and Waterloo. Next slide, please. In our budget and other financial information that we've presented to you in the past, we've shown you information from the BMA study, which is a study completed annually that analyzes each municipality's data from their financial information return and calculates key indicators such as tax debt payments as a % of own source revenue, which is essentially the calculation of the tax debt limit. On this slide, the data from 2019 financial information returns for all large lower tier municipalities in Ontario is shown. Also shown is Cambridge's current tax debt limit at 3.3%, which is approximately middle of this group. As Cambridge plans to issue more debt in the future, our tax debt limit is expected to rise to approximately 9.6% by 2026. As you can see by this chart, that puts Cambridge on the high end of the scale of the comparator large lower tier municipalities in Ontario, with all things being held equal in each of these other municipalities. Next slide, please. Another measure of the city's debt is the amount of total debt, which includes the tax funded, water sewer funded, and DC funded, outstanding per capita. As of 2020 year end, this was approximately $325 per person based on debt issued to date. With the further issuance of debt required that gets us up to that 217 million total, the debt per capita is expected to rise to close to $1,100 per person. While a good portion of this is DC funded, as seen on this graph, that still bears some risk in case of an economic downturn that results in less growth than expected for the city. If insufficient DCs are coming in to cover the debt charges, then the tax base would need to pay to make up for that. Next slide, please. Similar to the information on the previous slide, this slide shows the total debt outstanding per capita compared to other lower tier large municipalities from the BMA study. Again, Cambridge is currently middle of the group, and with the issuance of all debt up to the 217 million required, we would be at the top of the comparator group. Next slide, please. The previous slides in which we're comparing our debt forecast to other municipalities made the assumption of all else held even, that other comparator municipalities would maintain their same debt amounts or ratios. While we can't forecast for other municipalities, it's important to note that we did reach out to Kitchener and Waterloo for commentary on what they expect in the future. Kitchener expects their debt levels to continue to lower over the next few years and then level off. This slide here shows this and was taken from Kitchener's 2021 budget presentation information. Next slide, please. Similar to Kitchener, the City of Waterloo is also forecasting their debt levels to continue to decrease over the next 10 years and then level off. This slide was adapted from Waterloo's 2021 budget presentation information. Waterloo's debt policy limits debt funding to no more than 30% of a project's total funding. That 30% is a number you'll want to remember for later in the presentation. Over the course of the full 10-year projection, debt is projected to decline from $42 million in 2021 down to $10.9 million in 2029. This is a result of paying down the outstanding debt for Rim Park, and they're not expecting to issue any new tax-supported debt over the next 10 years. You may recall from an earlier slide that Cambridge's debt forecast is expected to reach $176.8 million for tax-supported operations in the 10-year forecast, compared to Kitchener at approximately $20 million and Waterloo at $10.9 million. If Kitchener and Waterloo's debt levels are reducing while Cambridge's are rising, this can raise affordability concerns within Cambridge. Next slide, please. When issuing debt, we also need to consider the impacts to the community and the affordability of property taxes. With the further issuance of approved but unissued debt and the debt forecasted in our 10-year capital plan, it will result in an increase in the tax levy of 3.88% over the next 5 years. It's important to remember that approving debt as a source of funding for capital projects results in an immediate increase to the operating budget for the future debt, principal, and interest payments. These increases each year will be in addition to inflationary impacts to maintain existing services, as well as any other operating impacts from capital projects, such as the recreation complex once it's open. Next slide, please. This slide shows you a breakdown of the tax levy impact of 3.88%, broken down by some significant capital projects in the forecast. As you can see, the greatest portion of the overall increase comes from the first 3 projects on this slide and result in an overall increase of 2.76% and include the Riverside Dam, followed by the recreation complex and Preston Auditorium. Next slide, please. In the next few slides, I'm going to show you some examples of projects that we're currently facing challenges with funding due to a variety of concerns. Next slide. But before I do that, I want to talk about this diagram that you may be familiar with. This model is used in project management and displays the constraints encountered when working on a project. What this model is meant to show is that when you increase or decrease any of these elements of cost, scope, or time, it will have an impact on the other elements. For example, where a project is running up against time constraints, it could lead to additional costs. Or an increase in scope may require equivalent increases in budget and/or the schedule in order to ensure the overall project remains in balance. So I want you to keep this diagram in mind as we walk through the next 3 slides. So next slide, please. The first project I want to talk about is Preston Auditorium. 3 years ago, this project was included in the capital budget forecast at $1.9 million. Sorry, $1.6 million. In 2022, the budget is now projected to be $18.3 million. That's an increase of 1,042%, or $16.7 million in 3 years. There are a number of reasons, or a number of issues that have led to this problem, and I'll go over them. First, the scope of work was originally planned for an expansion of space for female change rooms and an ice resurfacer bay. After extensive public engagement, the scope has expanded so that we are now planning for an expansion to add an additional ice pad, increased size of change rooms, additional storage, office, and meeting space for user groups, training and warm-up areas for users, additional seating and viewing space, possible renovation of the existing ice pad to make it NHL size, and the list goes on. Another problem is that the scope of work and the budget have increased in such a short time frame that we haven't had enough time to plan for the financial resources required for this project. Many of the city's reserves are underfunded, and therefore we can't fund the increase from other sources. If we proceed with this project now, rather than waiting until we can afford it, it will have to be funded by debt, which is why 96% of the project budget is funded from debt. And you may recall earlier in the presentation that I mentioned the City of Waterloo's debt policy only allows a maximum of 30% of a project budget can be funded from debt, and many other municipalities have similar policies like this. In the near future, you'll be seeing an update report on Preston Auditorium as a follow-up to the report that was brought to Council in May of this year. It includes the results of further public consultation with sport user groups. The report lays out a number of options for Council's consideration for this project. Next slide, please. The next project I want to talk about is Riverside Dam. In 2019, this project was in the capital forecast at $5.4 million, and you will see the project budget has increased significantly to $16.4 million as proposed in the 2022 capital budget. This is an increase of 204% or $11 million. Similar to Preston Aud, we haven't had the time to plan for this much of a financial increase, and with insufficient funding and reserves, this project is planned to be funded 93% from debt if it proceeds. A report has been prepared by staff that will be brought to Council in the next month that explains the reason for this increase and again lays out options for consideration on how to move forward with this project. Next slide, please. And one more significant project is the Fountain Street Soccer Complex. This project is a little different from the previous two because it's already been approved, but similarly, there was a significant increase in the budget from $6.2 million in 2019 to $13.1 million currently. This is a 110% increase or $6.8 million, and 80% of the budget is funded from debt. These three projects are just some of the more significant examples of financial challenges we're facing in the near future, and I wanted to bring my concerns to your attention and for your awareness as you make decisions on these projects and the 2022 budget over the next month. Next slide, please. Now I'll bring you back to this project management model and the theory behind good project management, and you can understand the situation we're currently facing with the projects that I've outlined on the previous slides. The scope of each project has grown substantially over the past 3 years within a short time frame, to a point where it's beginning to compromise the city's debt funding limits and putting us at the higher end of the debt capacity limits compared to other lower tier municipalities in Ontario. By increasing the scope of the projects without extending the project timelines, it creates pressure on the budget because we haven't had adequate time for sustainable financial planning of city resources. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, in the next month or so, Council will be deliberating the 2022 capital budget, as well as seeing reports that present options for Riverside Dam and for the renovation and expansion of Preston Auditorium. With each of these decision points, we'll need to be mindful of the balance between scope, time, and costs to mitigate further impacts on the city's debt capacity. You will likely hear from delegations on these projects, as you have in the past, who want the scope to increase even further. But with the final approval of these projects, it will be important to maintain a balance between timelines, scope, and affordability. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, similar to if we were managing our personal finances and buying a new house or other large purchase, we need to ensure we can afford the future payments without constraining our finances. Next slide, please. Before I close, I wanted to provide further information on other options that we can consider in the future. Many municipalities have implemented a capital levy that is used to fund the rehabilitation of existing assets and reduce their infrastructure deficit. If Cambridge were to implement a capital levy, instead of increasing the tax levy to pay debt charges, we could fund the rehabilitation of assets from this levy, which would free up funding to go towards new infrastructure. Finance team is currently working on an update to our reserve policies, which will include target balances so that there's greater awareness about the balances in our reserves compared to what is needed in the future. We can also undertake an update to our debt policy to either increase the current limit of 10% of own source revenues or consider a better balance in funding projects like Waterloo has in place with their limit of 30% of total project funding from debt. Or we could be even more restrictive in regards to future debt and start working towards a pay-as-you-go policy. Other municipalities have implemented this kind of a policy and only issue debt for large special projects that may have a greater payback in the future, such as some economic development projects. All of the information that has been presented is based on many assumptions, such as the pace of economic recovery, future interest charges, timing of when projects will proceed, and when we will need to issue debt. As Dave appropriately mentioned in the beginning, we'll need to manage wants, needs, and expectations as we consider the 2022 budget and the key projects that are recommended to be funded from debt. The challenges that have been presented show that we are beginning to compromise the city's debt funding limits and putting us at the higher end of the debt capacity limits compared to other large lower tier municipalities in Ontario. And next slide, please. And that is the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Cheryl, for a thoughtful and, I'm going to say it, a bit sobering presentation to really come to grips with the reality that we face as a city. And the work from you and your team is deeply appreciated as we go through the next few weeks with armed with some information that will help with some of the decisions that we need to make around budgets. So I'm going to look now for questions. Mr. Calder, please go ahead.
Quickly, Mayor McGarry, I just wanted to point out too that Cheryl's presentation will be circulated to you after this meeting so that you'll have some of those facts and figures in front of you during budget deliberations. And again, as we said, that tonight's exercise was not to make decisions, but to have a discussion around debt to prepare you for when those actual budget lines come forward in the next coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, and that's a good reminder. Councillor Wolf, go ahead.
Through you, Madam Mayor, to Cheryl, when you were showing comparisons to Kitchener and Waterloo, am I to understand that they won't be building anything new where they require debt from now till next 10 years?
Through you, Your Worship, when we did reach out to Kitchener and Waterloo, the information they gave us is that they will not be issuing any debt for projects from tax supported sources in the future. I'm not sure whether they're building new infrastructure, but funding it from reserves, possibly, if they have adequate reserves. They have mentioned that they will not be issuing debt for projects in the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing no other hands at the moment, I am going to just sort of put a couple things together. I sort of kept a rough tally here about the three main projects we were talking about: Preston Aud, the Preston Dam, and the Riverside Dam, and the soccer fields. And there was a couple of comparisons you did. It was back in around 2018 where the initial cost of each of these three projects was given, and then sort of the costs that are estimated today. So my rough guesstimate here was between those three projects, I think that there was about approximate 13.2 million that the city was looking at for all three of those projects. And again, I did a rough guesstimate here, and it comes up the total right now to 47 million over 700,000. So that leaves a difference of about $34.5 million. Is that about approximate cost that we're looking at has increased just in the last 3 years?
Yes, you are correct, Mayor McGarry. Good math.
Okay. I can certainly understand that there's differences. We've had several delegations and, user groups come forward in a couple of circumstances, but do you have any further comments about how these costs have gone up over the last 3 years or so from the guesstimates back in 2018?
To you, Mayor McGarry, I see Mr. Bromberg would like to comment, but also just from my understanding, the most significant impact is just the scope of the projects has increased. There's been a lot of consultation with community groups, and that is a good thing that we need to do as a city, certainly, and hear that feedback on what the community desires. But then it's our responsibility as administration to also make sure that we are balancing the affordability component as well. So taking that information from the community groups, but then making sure that we are delivering on as much as we can within a reasonable amount that the city can afford. So trying to balance all of those things can be a challenge, but that is what has led to, I believe, the scope creep that we've seen in a number of these projects that I've presented to you this evening.
Thank you. Who is going to speak to that? Mr. Bromberg, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I think Ms. Ayers satisfied the question around the Preston Auditorium, indicating the scope creep. I'll just provide maybe a little bit more detail around the Preston Dam. As you indicated, back in 2018, you were looking at an approximate cost of about 6.5 million. But that was early on in the design. That was part of the EA process. So through that EA process, there were a number of minister orders that we were required to satisfy, and through the public engagement, the proposed new dam was set back, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40 meters from where the original location is. There were some fish ladders that were required to be constructed, as well as some operating gates. So a number of those additional items that came out of that EA process, again, as Ms. Ayers indicates, sort of that scope creep, added another $2.8 million. Inflation over the four years from 2018 to when the proposed construction is to start in 2022 totals about $1.8 million when you look at about a 5% construction inflation rate over that time period. And keep in mind, back in 2018, as you're going through that EA process, you have a very preliminary design. So there's plus or minus 30% in there. In this case, unfortunately, we're looking at a plus 30% in terms of where we are with the initial design. So you total that and you come to the neighborhood of 12.6, 12.7 million. Again, currently we're at 60% design. And so good project management would indicate that again has about a 20% contingency. As you get to about 90% design, now you're looking at a 10% contingency fund, but at 60%, it's 20%. So that adds in another 2.5 million, bringing you to that $15.2 million figure. So if I could just summarize, it's the contingency that we need to add. It's the 4 years of inflation, and then it's the conditions that came out of that EA process that is the reason you're going from about $6.5 million to 2022 dollars of $15.2 million.
Thank you. Ms. Ayers, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor McGarry. And I just wanted to add one further point that the corporate leadership team has discussed while preparing the budget this year is how can we prevent things like this from happening again in the future. And one of the things we've talked about is ensuring that we have preliminary design and detailed design in the budget prior to when we're approving the construction projects. So building more of a gap and ensuring that we have good, solid information before we bring forward the construction budget will help us in the future to be able to plan for these projects. Like I mentioned in that chart, the scope, the cost, and the time, we're going to make sure that there's more time built between the design and the construction phases so that we ensure that we have adequate funding available for construction.
And just a point of clarification on that, I know that partly due to the pandemic and what's going on in the construction industry, but usually over the approval of these projects and the start, is there usually some funds built into those costs to accommodate increases in either labor or materials or both on any construction project?
Through you, Mayor McGarry. Typically, the projects, once completed, should be constructed in a timely manner so that we don't need to worry about concerns like escalation in costs. So it's not typically built into the budgets.
Thanks for that clarification. Mr. Bromberg?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor McGarry. In addition to what Ms. Ayers indicated, through the current construction environment with the pandemic, we have seen a significant increase in terms of construction costs. So not only are we dealing with the scope creep, and I'm specifically talking about the Preston Auditorium, we have revised our per square foot construction cost from $275 a square foot to $300 a square foot. We do have a contingency as well. As I indicated earlier, that contingency is much larger as we're still in preliminary design stages. But as we get to 90% design and 95% design, that contingency fund is reduced down to 10%, which is typical of a project management type best practice.
Thank you. That does clarify a little bit of the contingency because we go from 30 to 20 to 10. So that's certainly clear. Thank you. Councillor Reid. And just before we go to Councillor Reid, I note that Councillor Liggett is coming in. Councillor Liggett, good evening. Just need to ask the Ontario Municipal Conflict of Interest Act and if you have any declarations of pecuniary interest this evening.
No.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Reid, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you. It is noted that the three projects that you were describing all happen to be projects that are in Preston. And I just wanted to note that, and I think that, many of us feel that it's been time for Preston to have some additional infrastructure added to them. But secondly, I want to really appeal to our staff and say, okay, we have this problem and it seems like an almost insurmountable problem. But do you have any suggestions as to how we can deal with this problem now and still maintain that we want to continue to build this infrastructure? Or are we looking at saying some of those infrastructures simply will not be done? And I'm looking to you for some help in what possible ways we can deal with this issue.
Ms. Ayers, go ahead.
Through you, Mayor McGarry. Councillor Reid, those are some good questions. And a couple of options that we can consider are As I mentioned, there will be some reports coming forward to council over the next month on these projects that will lay out some options for your consideration and how to move forward. There are different options in terms of the scope of work that can be completed. We can also look at potentially delaying the projects for a period of time until we are in a better position to be able to finance them. And then, as I say, just looking at the scope of the work, maybe we can revise that and bring down the overall cost of the project so that less funding can be applied from debt. So there are a number of options, and we will be bringing that forward to you with some reports over the next coming weeks.
Okay, that slide is helpful. Thank you. Okay, any further questions? Councillor Mann, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, I think the comment made that you made right after the presentation was that this is very sobering, and it is. And when we look at the tremendous growth that we have in our city and the services that we want to be able to provide to our community, maybe we are being too ambitious. As Councillor Reid said, I noticed that the first 3 items on the agenda or on the list are all in the Ward 1 and Ward 3 area. Or Preston area of Cambridge, and that's concerning because Cambridge, Preston has waited a long time. We've waited for the dam, we've waited for Headstrom Park, we've waited for Preston Auditorium, and now I think we really have to. I'll be interested to see what staff come back with as far as recommendations are concerned, because you can't have your cake and eat it all at one time, is what I'm thinking, and we're going to have to decide, make some tough decisions about what do we do to be able to accumulate debt that we feel is acceptable, because if we do all 3 projects, we price ourselves right out of the market of doing anything. And so I think there are going to be some really tough decisions that we have to make with the proposals that staff bring forward. And this is going to be a tough time because we have to be mindful of our constituents who are the taxpayers. And so I don't have too many questions. Well, I have lots of questions, but they're questions that are the same that everybody else has. How do we deal with so much debt and continue with the projects that we have? So I guess we're asking staff to pull more rabbits out of the hat, and I think the hat's empty. Those are my comments, Madam Chair. Thanks. Thanks for the presentation, Cheryl. That was excellent. That really gave us a good overview of some of the projects that we have on the go and the state that we find ourselves in as far as being able to finance them. So thanks to you and staff for that.
Thank you. Looking for further questions or comments. I'm just going to ask again another question, just really following up on what Councillor Mann had to say to Ms. Ayers. And this is really looking to other municipalities. And I know at the beginning of the presentation, you sort of brought around some comparators to other like-sized municipalities and how they're dealing with their particular debt. Is there sometimes some sharing of information or from different strategies amongst other municipalities that find themselves in much the same way as we may, in order to figure out how to provide the amenities that we need for economic development for our residents, and also how we fund the debt going forward?
Thank you, Mayor McGarry. I find there is a lot of collaboration between municipalities, which is something I really enjoy about working in this field. And especially when we attend conferences with our peers, there's a lot of networking and sharing of ideas, which is very helpful. And that last slide that I presented that laid out some of the options, like implementing a capital levy, updating our reserve policies to include target balances, reviewing our debt policy, and pay-as-you-go financing. Those are all strategies that municipalities have in place in order to manage their debt levels and the balances in their reserves. So that is why I was suggesting that these are things that we should be looking into further and putting in place in Cambridge in order to manage our finances in a longer term manner and ensuring that we are sustainable for the long term.
Thank you. And I might just go back to the recently passed bylaw that we did about naming and sponsorship policies. And in noting from some of the possibilities of gaining some revenue back from those policies, when I look to the huge increase from 2018 to now, it seems that even though we have now instituted those sponsorship policies, I can't imagine that we'll get enough there to really make too much of an impact against some of the capital costs that we're facing right now. Was that a consideration as to how we can go ahead and still provide the amenities that our city's looking for, but try and obtain some revenue from other sources?
Yes, thank you, Mayor McGarry. That is certainly an option and something that we're starting to discuss now that council has approved that policy. We're starting to put together an internal team of staff to roll out that policy and consider projects such as the ones I presented to you this evening that may be good candidates for moving forward with naming rights to facilities or sponsorship for ongoing costs associated with them. So that is certainly that we are starting to turn our minds to and prepare for in the future.
Thank you. Councillor Mehta, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to say I really appreciate the presentation. I know a lot of work went into it, and it is sobering. It is good to get that information as we plan for the future, and you know, tough decisions may have to be made. I do have a question. I don't need an answer right now, but it might be something to look for in the future. And I'm glad Mayor McGarry raised a sponsorship element and seeing what can be done there. But another question I have is there any benefit to having mixed use developments for some of the new facilities, which is what the city of Guelph is doing, I believe, with their new library downtown. And I think the Vaughan Library, they're looking at some kind of a mixed use development there too. Are projects like that worthwhile? Like, does that help with the budget element at all? And I don't need an answer like this instant, but is that something that could be looked at if there happen to be any benefits with that approach? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we'll take that as a comment at the moment, Councillor Mehta, and you've raised a good point. I know that we are looking at something like that with a couple of other projects, as well as we look to try and intensify and make best use of our land. And we've seen that in a couple of ways recently in Cambridge, how we're doing more mixed use development in order to sort of satisfy all the plans that we need to comply with. Well, seeing no further questions or comments, I think I wanted to thank Ms. Ayers and Ms. Fisher for providing the opportunity for discussion around this matter this evening. And I think we'll move forward now into the rest of our agenda. Thank you so much for the work you've done. And I know that we'll be in close contact as we move through the next few weeks looking at our budget. So members of council will now move forward, and we're going to the motion to receive correspondence and presentations. So the following motion is related to items of correspondence and presentations at council. Councillor Wolf, you have this motion. Will you please read it in its entirety?
I would ask the clerk to read it for me, please.
Yep, Madam Clerk.
Motion to receive, moved by Councillor Wolf, seconded by Councillor Mehta. Recommendation that all presentations and correspondence from the November 2nd, 2021 Special Council Workshop be received.
Thank you. I'll now ask the clerk to call for the vote. Madam Clerk.
Councillor Mehta.
In favor?
Councillor Hamilton.
In favor.
Councillor Liggett,
In favor.
Councillor Mann,
In favor?
Councillor Reid,
In favor?
Councillor Wolf,
In favor?
Mayor McGarry,
In favor.
and that carries.
Thank you. Our next item is the confirmatory bylaw. Sorry, turn the page too fast. Councillor Liggett, you have this motion. Will you please read it in its entirety?
I don't have any paperwork, so maybe the clerk can read that for me, please. Thank you.
Sure, Madam Clerk.
We just need an alternative seconder for this one. Councillor
Councillor
Hamilton.
Hamilton.
Thank you. Moved by Councillor Liggett, seconded by Councillor Hamilton, that bylaw 21075, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of Council of the Corporation of the City of Cambridge, be enacted and passed.
Thank you. I'll now ask the clerk to call for the vote. Madam Clerk.
Councillor Mehta,
In favor?
Councillor Hamilton,
In favor.
Councillor Liggett,
In favor.
Councillor Mann,
In favor?
Councillor Reid,
In favor?
Councillor Wolf,
In favor?
Mayor McGarry,
In favor.
and that carries.
Thank you. We've now reached the end of the agenda for today. So Councillor Mehta, you have the motion for close of meeting. Will you please read it in its entirety?
Well, thank you, Your Worship. Can I get the clerk to read that? Thank you.
Absolutely. Madam Clerk.
Moved by Councillor Mehta, seconded by Councillor Reid, that the council meeting does now adjourn at 6:26 p.m.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask the clerk to call for the vote. Madam Clerk.
Councillor Mehta,
In favor?
Councillor Hamilton,
In favor.
Councillor Liggett,
In favor.
Councillor Mann,
In favor?
Councillor Reid,
In favor?
Councillor Wolf,
In favor?
Mayor McGarry,
In favor.
and that carries.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our meeting for tonight. Thanks for joining us. And on behalf of council, stay safe, look after each other, and please be kind. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night,
Night,
everyone.
everybody.